welcome everyone. I'm Josh Wright, Executive Director of Ideas 42, and we're co-sponsoring this interview discussion with the Political Reform Program and Mark Schmidt here at New America Foundation. I'm just going to quickly introduce the interviewee and interviewer and then get off the stage and let the exciting conversation start. So we're lucky to be joined by Robert Frank, a professor of management and professor of economics at Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management and a distinguished senior fellow at Demos. For more than a decade, you've been able to read columns in the Economic View in the New York Times by Professor Frank, and his papers have appeared in numerous economic journals, prestigious economic journals. We're here to talk about his book, Success and Luck, although I also like other of his books, The Winner-Take-All Society back in 1995 with Philip Cook, The Economic Naturalist, and The Darwin Economy. I would just say anyone who can make the case for doing infrastructure improvements in roads by comparing driving a Porsche and a Ferrari is somebody that you would like to listen to. And Professor Frank will be interviewed by Ann Lowrey, an economics reporter, a former staff writer for Slate, the New York Times, New York Magazine. She's currently contributing to the Times Magazine, while also writing a book on universal basic income, which I'm very excited to read, which will be coming out next year from Crown. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks to everyone for coming out. I know you all have plenty of stuff that you could be doing now, and the scarce resource going forward, a psychiatrist friend of mine told me, is going to be more and more the willingness of other people to pay attention to you. And so if you come out and sit in an audience where you can't leave comfortably for 45 minutes or an hour, that's a huge luxury, and I'm appreciative that you're here. The book was a really fun one to work on. I've been thinking about luck for a long time. I've escaped narrowly from a couple of near-death experiences. I've experienced way more than my share of good fortune in career and other domains of life. And so it's just been a subject that's naturally drawn my attention. The fact is, we tend to notice luck only in situations where it's very vivid, like some of the experiences I've had. But luck affects us really in ways that most people tend not to notice. It has a very profound effect on how our lives shape up. Lives are a sequence of small events. Many of them have to do with your talent and hard work, to be sure. But interspersed among them are a lot of seemingly insignificant random occurrences. And what we know is that everything's highly path dependent. If any one of those stages had occurred in a slightly different way, that would have changed the angle of your trajectory in some small way. And where you ended up would be very, very different from where you did end up. Maybe you would have been even more successful, but possibly too, even though you were very successful on the path you actually did take, you might not have been at all successful on some slightly different path that you took. So if somebody wins the lottery, we notice that. If a pedestrian gets run down by a motorist asleep at the wheel, that's bad luck, we notice that. But these more subtle kinds of luck, we tend not to pay much mind to. We're the victims of what's known as hindsight bias. When we see an outcome, we have a tendency to think that it's much more easily predicted than, in fact, it turns out to be. We see something happen and we look for the obvious explanations of it. So the Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world. Why is that? Well, we look for qualities that make a work of art worthy of note. Duncan Watts has written illuminatingly about this. He had visited the Louvre, fought his way up close to the painting. If you've been there, you'll recall that you have to elbow 300 people aside to get a close look at it. It's very small. It's not very impressive, at least I didn't think it was. But what Duncan noted was that in an adjacent gallery, there hang two other Leonardos from the exact same period, using the same novel brushstrokes that the Mona Lisa displayed. no one was crowding in to get a closer look at them. Why is that, he wondered. And so he did a little reading about the history of the painting, and it turned out that before 1911, nobody had much remarked about the Mona Lisa. It was by a very distinguished artist, to be sure, but for several hundred years, nobody thought it was anything special. Then, in 1911, Vincenzo Peruggia stole the painting from the Louvre. He was a custodian. He tucked it under his cloak one evening and walked out with it. That theft made headlines around the world. For the first time, it was technologically possible for newspapers to reproduce images of the painting on their front pages, and so there was a huge dust-up. The crime went unsolved for 2 years. Finally, Peruggia tried to sell the painting to the director of the Uffizi in Florence. He thought it was an Italian painting. It belonged in Italy. The director turned him in. There was another explosion of media coverage, papers printing pictures of the painting all around the globe. And ever since then, it's become a symbol of Western art and culture. But why is it famous? Watts writes, not because it has qualities X, Y, and Z objectively, although that's what the art historians have focused on. It's famous because somebody stole it one night. It's like Kim Kardashian in that way. It's famous for being famous and not because of any objective qualities that it brought. So chance matters in those ways in almost every instance to some degree or another. Bryan Cranston, whom I had never heard of before my wife and I started watching Breaking Bad. I had an argument with my editor. I wanted to call it the best television series of all time. He finally persuaded me that we had to call it one of the best television series of all time. He was nobody, relatively nobody, in the acting profession, well into middle age. He was the dad on Malcolm in the Middle, a show I never saw. People said he was pretty good in that role, but it was a sitcom. He'd never had a leading dramatic role. The studio bosses didn't want to let Gilligan cast him in the Walter White role in Breaking Bad. They wanted a name actor, somebody they were going to spend a lot of money on this, so they offered the part to John Cusack. Cusack turned it down. They offered it to Matthew Broderick. Broderick didn't want to do it. Only then was Gilligan able to persuade them to offer it to Bryan Cranston, and Cranston, of course, went on to win 4 Emmys during the show's 5 seasons. He's now the very most sought-after actor in the profession in his slice of the demographic. But as he's the very first to admit, if you don't have a little luck like that, you can labor the whole time and not really get off the ground in your career. So my claim is not that the people who are very successful don't work hard and aren't talented. Many people hear about the book and they assume that's what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. The message instead is that working hard and being really good by themselves are not enough. That in almost every case, the people who win today's big winner-take-all contests are not the most talented, hard-working people in the pool. They're someone from the pack breathing down their neck who are almost as talented and hardworking, but also happen to be a little bit luckier than the most talented contestant. So with that in mind, the policy significance of the observation seems to be that if you look at the experimental evidence and other forms of evidence that we have on this question, if you think you did it all yourself, you develop a sense of entitlement that makes you very reluctant to part with any of the resources that have come your way as a result of your success. The 2 speeches that stuck out most in my mind since I've been thinking about this topic were 2 given in 2012 during the election campaign, one by Barack Obama, the other by Elizabeth Warren. Both of them came to be known as the "you didn't build that" speeches. The point in each case was that if you're a successful business owner, try to remember that you didn't do that completely by yourself. You shipped your goods to market on roads the community paid for, you hired workers we paid to educate. You were protected by police and firefighters that the community hired to do that job for you. And part of the social contract is, sure, you get to keep a big chunk of what you made, but you have a responsibility to pay forward so the next group that comes along has an opportunity to succeed just as you did. But more and more, people reject that view. I think when people heard those speeches, what they seem to have heard was that Obama was telling them, you don't deserve your success. You don't merit the lofty position that you occupy in society. That was not what he was saying. I'm not saying that Bryan Cranston doesn't deserve praise for being an unbelievably good actor. He is all of that. But he was also lucky, and to recognize that you're lucky makes you much more willing to pay forward for the common good. If you were born in the South Sudan, you would not have become a success, almost certainly. And the difference between here and the South Sudan is centuries of very expensive investment in building the environment that enables hardworking, talented people to make a real possibility of succeeding. And people are more and more reluctant to fund those investments. So if it doesn't work to do what Barack Obama tried to do and what Elizabeth Warren tried to do to tell successful people that they've been lucky, what can we do to make them recognize that they've been lucky and encourage them to take a more generous attitude toward funding the future? Well, as it happens, I've stumbled upon what I believe is a winning strategy in response to that question. I'm going to ask, hopefully, that you'll try this out in conversations with your successful friends. Don't tell them that they've been lucky. Don't point out to them the various ways in which they've been lucky. Do this instead. Ask them whether they can recall examples of good fortune they might have enjoyed along their path to the top. There's almost a magic alchemy that occurs when you approach the question that way. If you ask them to think of examples, they don't seem angry or defensive in response to that question. On the contrary, their eyes light up. Each example they can think of a lucky break they enjoyed when they were coming through, they want to tell you about it, and one memory leads to another, and before long, they're asking, why don't we support this? Why don't we support that? How could we have allowed the system to have failed people in these ways or those ways? It's a totally transformational way of igniting that conversation. And I think if we have that conversation, the evidence is very clear that once people become mindful of the fact that they're lucky to be in the privileged position that they're in, they become vastly more generous towards people going forward. So I'll close on that note. I mean, there's a lot of money to spend if we're going to make the investments that we haven't been supporting for the last, really 40 years. People don't want to think about the sacrifices they would have to make if we really were serious about raising the money to fund those investments. But I'll just note as a final point that doing that would be way less painful than most people seem to think. I had a conversation with a colleague once over lunch. He watches a lot of Fox News. Did I know about all these taxes Obama had in store for us? No, I didn't know about them. He was shocked. You know why I don't know about them? Because that doesn't matter for people like us. What do you mean? Well, we've got everything we need, right? He and I have successful textbooks. In Ithaca, that means we don't spend everything we earn. Maybe in Washington or New York we would, but we've got more money than we need. So what's at issue? They're not going to change the tax laws in a way that would keep you from getting what you need. No, he agreed. So what might they do? They might make it harder for you to get what you want? Yeah, that was his worry. Well, what do people like us want? We want special things. We have everything we need. We want the special things. Special is a relative concept. Where we live, it's a house with a sweeping view of the lake, or maybe a choice slip at the marina, or maybe a painting by somebody who's known. How do you get those things? You have to bid against people with similar tastes and incomes, and the high bidders walk away with them. Well, think about this. How is the outcome of those bidding contests affected if and we're all prosperous peoples here, if your tax rates go up and mine do too? The answer is that they're not affected in any way at all. The apartment with a view goes to the same person as before. So there's stuff we need to do. People recognize that. They don't want to do it because they think it will be painful, but it won't be painful. We're just sitting on top of huge unexploited opportunities that if we would just sort of think more clearly about what the trade-offs are that we face, we could make progress in ways that would make virtually everybody better off. That's the message of the book. I'm grateful that you came out to hear me talk about it, and maybe if you have questions, or Annie will surely have some, we can get into all that as we go along. Thank you.
Whatever. So just so people know, Bob and I are going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. But I'll just start him off. And so I'm curious as to, you make this great case in the book for everybody contributing a little bit more, but what you think those contributions could go to make it so that we had a society that had more room for meritocracy and maybe a little less room for luck. It's a big question. But.
I graduated from college in 1966. My family didn't have a lot of money, but when I graduated, I had zero debt. That's not true anymore. The students whose families are like mine, who come to Cornell, even though Cornell is one of the most aggressive schools in its attempts to make funds available to people whose families don't have a lot of money, it's quite common for students to graduate with $30,000 or $40,000 worth of debt at the end of that time. So at a time when you're trying to launch your career and the miracle of compounded interest ought to be working for you, instead it's working exactly against you. You're just fighting debt the whole way. Never mind the question of who gets to go to college in the first place. There's a very chilling statistic that I report in the book. It's that if you're a high-income family and you have children who scored in the bottom quartile in math in the 8th grade, those children are more likely to get a college degree than if you're the child of a low-income family and you scored in the top quartile in math in the 8th grade. Nobody hears that statistic and say, yeah, that's the way the world ought to be. It used to be there were music programs in the schools, there were sports programs, there were drama programs. Cutbacks of one kind or another mean most of those projects are ended now. If they have them, they're on an extracurricular basis where you have to pay a fee in order to do it, or if they don't exist as part of the school system, your parents hire private coaches to offer them to you independently. This is not the way we think a society would be justly organized, and it's just a matter of coming up with the resources to make sure that the kids who don't start with much would actually have a shot.
Mm-hmm. And so in thinking about and reporting the book, there's some really interesting anecdotes, and you recommend asking people to talk about the ways in which they were lucky and how that helped them become successful. It seems to me that it intersects with a very interesting contemporary conversation about privilege and privilege checking. It's two sides of the same coin. And so how have you found it getting people to, how have you found have been the best ways to get people to acknowledge this? And as a society, do you feel like we're moving towards this broader conversation about accepting that there is no meritocracy, or at least it's very, very heavily covered by where you were born and who you were born to?
Yeah, I don't think we're on a fast track toward progress in this conversation. No, that was really my hope. No book I've ever written has had any impact. I probably should know this by now. The first book I wrote was called Choosing the Right Pond. It came out in January. I thought by luck, partly, I'd solved some important social problems in the process of thinking about that book. Well, by September, October, there'll be bills wending their way through the House and Senate to deal with these issues. And here we are, 35 years later, nothing has happened of the sort. So, I think the capacity to suspend disbelief, to think you can make a difference is Probably not a bad thing. People wouldn't start businesses at all if they knew the odds of failure were more than 50% in the first 5 years. So we're lucky that people are naive about such things, probably. But on the other hand, lightning strikes. Nobody, I think, would have confidently predicted 5 years ago that a majority of the voters in every state virtually now think that it's okay that same-sex couples be permitted to marry. There were huge majorities thinking that was not a good idea as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. Once a conversation starts, once people begin to tip in a certain direction, most people don't know what it's reasonable to believe. They shouldn't know that. The world's too complicated. You follow the lead of others for most things that you make decisions about. And so as each person changes her mind about an issue, that's one more a slight tipping of opinion in another direction. And once it reaches a certain point, it can tip very, very rapidly. So yeah, I wrote the book in the hope of launching a few more of those conversations, not in any impassioned expectation that this would happen, but that when I die, I'd like to be able to say, oh, I tried to change the conversation, and that was enough.
Yeah, and I'm interested in what you make of a Trump phenomenon that's in fact a very old phenomenon, where very often the communities that are the greatest recipients of government aid, are most reliant on the government for investment, are also communities that have disproportionately high percentages of voters for candidates who would probably cut those programs. So Arlie Hochschild has a great new book where she goes to a parish in Louisiana that has been environmentally degraded by the oil and gas industry and is yet very reliant on, also very reliant on federal funds, and they're Trump voters. And so there's been numerous examples of this happening. I'm interested as to what you make of it and how this plays into the conversation about meritocracy and luck.
Yeah, the Theta Scotchball at Harvard has studied this issue too, and one common thread that runs through it is that people think the people that they perceive as being one rung lower on the ladder than they are taking things from them. And so I think somehow to change that conversation, it's got to be made clear that when you support Planned Parenthood, when you have maybe you'll discover a better support for an income floor under families, that we get better outcomes, not just for the people below you, but also for you. But I don't think we've been effective in making it clear that this is not us versus them. This is, there are steps we could take that would benefit all of us, really. Mm-hmm. The clear finding is that once you've reached a certain level of prosperity in society, absolute resources don't matter much. People were very happy in the 50s and 60s on a fraction of the income that even poor families have now. What's really important is the whole package of public and private environment that we live in. And if we all scaled back a little bit or didn't grow as fast privately, there would be investments we could make in the public sphere that would really make all of us prosper a lot more. The example that Josh mentioned is one I mentioned in the book. Who would be happier? The driver of a Ferrari on pothole-ridden roads or the driver of a Porsche 911 on well-paved roads? The low-tax society that we have enables rich people to buy the more expensive car, the Ferrari. It's $333,000. People drive it on roads riddled with foot-deep potholes. That's not a good experience for a driver. If instead you would buy a Porsche 911 for $150,000, the money you would save would more than finance tax receipts sufficient to maintain the roads at Germany-level standards. And you could just ask, which is more fun, to drive my Porsche 911 Turbo on these good roads or to drive the Ferrari on these roads like the Parkway going north out of New York City, it's no contest. But people don't think in those terms. They don't think that if we all invest, then we could have something that we value greatly. They just think, if I cut back, what would I have to, if I paid more tax, oh, then I have to buy a worse car. They don't think what else could change if I paid a little bit more tax.
Yeah. Driving a Ferrari on potholes sounds fun to me, actually.
No, it's not. It's
I
not
don't
really.
think I'll ever have the chance, thankfully. And so what do you think has happened that this conversation has become so much more about us versus them than looking around at the inequality that we have experienced, the wage stagnation that we've experienced, and instead saying, hey, we actually need to put more into public investment. We need to do more for others. And that means those of us that have more should be paying more.
You know, in the book, I propose a progressive consumption tax as one step we could take that would try to steer more resources away from categories where they don't seem to be doing much for people into investments that would actually make a real difference in people's lives. So the average wedding now costs $31,000. In New York, that average, in Manhattan, the borough of Manhattan, it's $76,000. Among the people in the top 0.1%, that doesn't buy you a carnation to get married in. It's really several $1 million of expenditure. All of these dollars are spent, I think, in good faith. They want the guests who come to their party to experience it as a special occasion, but special is just inherently a relative concept. Special means not putting on a party that's way less elaborate than everybody else puts on. And so when all the income goes to the top, they spend more on those things. That means if you don't spend more, people go home saying your party was a bust. And rather than do that, they spend more too. And so they really do have a legitimate sense that they need these dollars in order to achieve their goals. What they don't, I think, process correctly is that if they didn't have as many of those dollars and others like them didn't either, then they wouldn't need to spend so much to achieve special in terms of a foyer in a mansion or a wedding party that would please the guests. It's not a natural way to think about it, actually. So why don't we think of it in those terms? I would be astonished if I met somebody on the street who thought about the problem in that way. Mm-hmm. So I think we really do have to have this conversation and sort of push it out there if it's going to change people's way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and I remember during the recession there was all this like great thumb sucking about whether the recession would be a corrective to this, and I really don't think that it has been. If anything, I think things have gotten worse. Yeah, at least from my perspective.
And I stress it's not a moral indictment of rich people, that the fact that they've gotten more money and have been spending more on everything, that's what you all do, that's what I do when we get a lot more money, we spend more on things, and then that becomes the new norm. You know, the diamonds get bigger, the mansions get bigger, the cars get more expensive. But if we all had less to spend on those things, we would spend less, and the standards that define adequate would quickly adjust accordingly. But no one really seems to get it. So people ask, if this is such a great idea, why don't we do it? Well, that's a good question. That's your question. And that's the best I've been able to do at coming up with an answer. It's kind of complicated to think about why this is such a good idea.
Mm-hmm. So that's great. And with that, let's open it up to questions from the audience. If people have questions, we have a microphone. I think there's one right in the back over there.
Jim Sang. For me, the word luck has a certain, I know it when I see it, character to it. And I look at the dictionary, it doesn't help much. As an economic scientist, can you provide me a stronger definition of the word luck? Or am I stuck with the, I know it when I see it?
You know, there were several reviewers of my book on Amazon who seemed quite distressed that I didn't provide a precise definition of what I meant by luck. For my purposes, that just wasn't my focus. I think of it as anything that affects your outcome that you didn't have direct control over. So it might be the environment in which you're born. If you're born here rather than in the South Sudan, that's good luck for you. If you did not get run over by a driver who fell asleep at the wheel. That's good luck for you too. Anything that happens that benefits you that you didn't have direct control over, that's good luck in my scheme. There's been much written about how to think about luck and what really is luck and what's not luck, but that's all I meant by it.
Go ahead. There's a bunch of questions over here.
Thank you very much. Peter Matlin, also Cornell, Dyson School. Two quick questions. One, is there anything uniquely American about the psychology that you're talking about? And I guess I'd pivot around the concept of rugged individualism, but is there anything uniquely American? Second question is, your core arguments in terms of the impact of chance and luck in achieving success seem to be very closely aligned with Malcolm Gladwell's outliers. And I'm just wondering, could you quickly compare and contrast your thesis with his?
I think there is something distinctly American here. The British readers I've talked with say, yeah, people don't have quite that same I did it all myself attitude there as we see here. I paid $500 for the right to use one sentence as an epigram in my book. When I learned how much it was going to cost me, I debated whether it was really worth it, but in the end I decided to go ahead. It was E.B. White's line from an essay that he'd written in the 30s, and if I can recall it verbatim, it was, luck is not a subject you can mention in the presence of self-made men. And I probably repeat it too often because I've spent $500. I feel like I've got to get my money out of it, worth out of it. But every American audience resonates with that remark. They seem to have all met people who are like that. And in the book, I describe an episode where I had written a column in the Times about how social scientists were discovering that chance events play a much more important role in life outcomes than most people think. I got a call on the next day from Fox Business News. They wanted me to come on and discuss the piece. Well, I sort of had a hunch that it wouldn't be a friendly interview, but I got there and it was 6 minutes of nonstop blast furnace directed at me. Did I know how, you're saying the American dream isn't real. Do you know how hard I've worked, how much talent I brought? I came here with nothing. This guy was just convinced that I had insulted him. I hadn't insulted him, but such is the power of that view in the United States that people just aren't willing to engage once they think you've said that they were lucky in any minor way. I don't think it's the same, or at least not to the same degree in other cultures. The Gladwell book I love. I cite several examples from it. The hockey players being born in the first part of the year. Pure chance. You're the oldest player on your team in all the youth leagues growing up, so of course you're going to be more likely to be chosen for the all-star team and get sent to the teams with the best coaching, and so you're more likely to be chosen to play in the NFL when you grow up. But you can't really say that that's anything that you deserve moral credit for, I don't believe. And CEOs even, if you're born in July or August, you're probably one of the youngest kids in your class. And that means you're less likely to hold a leadership position when you're a junior and senior in high school, and you're going to earn lower wages on average for the rest of your life. You're less likely. There are about 20% fewer CEOs born in those months than we would expect on the basis of chance alone. So yeah, there's a lot of the kind of stuff that Gladwell talked about that's directly relevant for my thesis. He does not explore where do you go with this? If people aren't aware that they were lucky, what's the significance of that? Well, it makes them stingy. It makes them hostile to paying their fair share of taxes. And we know that if we can induce them to feel grateful for whatever situation they're in, they suddenly get magically much more generous. So I think unless we can persuade people to get more generous at funding the public sphere, there's just going to continue to be all these missed opportunities. Extra money on mansions and more expensive cars buys us nothing. Extra money on a Zika program would get us something we value.
Here, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us here, Bob. Quick comment and a question. And the comment is just that I think it's important not only that, to ask people who are super successful about the role of luck, it's also really important to acknowledge the role of luck for ourselves who aren't choosing between Ferraris and Porsches, but we have the good fortune to have work that's interesting and basically sufficient income. I mean, that to me, that's tremendous luck in itself. And I know many similarly positioned people who haven't had that luck, and I think to set that example and get away from the idea that there's a 1% and then a 99%, because there's really, luck plays a lot of role at a lot of levels. The question I have, something you said at the end of your beginning remarks, and you've alluded to a couple times, kind of reminded me of the concept that the economist Peter Linder talks about, the free lunch paradox, the idea that you actually can spend a society, particularly like Western European societies, can actually spend significantly more on social services at really at no cost to economic growth. And I'm wondering if, like, the points you raised about, positional goods at the top end, is that related? Are those concepts related, and how do they fit together?
That last point is the theoretical underpinning of the claim that we could all spend more on public investment without giving up anything that matters to us. Again, it's a simple point, but people don't think in these terms. So in 1980, weddings cost $10,000 on average. Now it's $31,000. Does anybody think that people who are getting married this is in inflation-adjusted dollars now, does anybody think people who were getting married in 1980 were happier, or less happy, rather, because they were spending only a third as much as people are spending now? I haven't met anybody who's willing to argue that. There's actually a paper, it's in the last year, they've shown that couples who spend more than $20,000 on their wedding are, the percentage is 12% per year more likely to divorce than couples who spend between $5,000 and $10,000 on their wedding. So it may actually be worse collectively for people who spend a lot than people who spend a little. So that's just the distinguishing feature of pure economic waste. Could we take those same dollars and spend them on public projects that would produce demonstrable benefits for people? We know we've got a whole $3.6 trillion worth of overdue infrastructure maintenance that we need to attend to. There's no shortage of places to put that money, and where it could be gotten from is and we don't have to specify in detail where it would come from, the steeply progressive consumption tax would just produce the revenue by automatically steering it away from the least urgent category. So the tax is on your income, just as you report it now to the IRS, minus how much you save during the year. We document that for 401k plans and the like. That difference is how much you spent during the year. Low rates in the beginning, but then once you're spending $5-6 million a year, that's a lot of consumption. I think if you're willing to say that the next dollar you're about to spend isn't for something urgent, then we can say making that thing you were about to buy twice as expensive by having a very steep marginal tax rate on consumption at that level would get you to refrain from spending that dollar on that, or if you do spend it, you'd pay tax on it that would fund a public investment that would yield vastly more than the utility of it. It's fiscal alchemy. If everybody cuts back on such things, that frees up money at no cost to anyone. Yeah, great question. That's a good way to formalize it. This is the argument that justifies Linder's claim about that.
Hi. I think that there's also an issue where people think God is taking care of them because they're good and they're successful. You know, God, I pray to God and he takes care of me. Well, other people who aren't being taken care of probably aren't as good as I am. Even in the colonial days, there were actually religious questions of that nature, whereas if you were a very upstanding person, God is showing that you're saved. Whereas if you were an unhealthy person that had a lot of problems, God is showing that you're not saved. And I think that continues today in a point of view.
I mean, it's clear that many people have deep commitments to religious faith. My mother was such a person. I said I'd had several near-death experiences. One of them I survived against very long odds. She thought that I was destined to survive that experience. That's never been a comfortable way of thinking about things for me personally, but unlike some of my friends, I have no contempt for anyone who thinks about things that way. That it's clear that people around the world have embraced religious faith ever since the beginning of time, and that, I think it's arrogant to say they're not getting anything of value from doing that. So no, I don't think anything I've written in the book is in conflict with the notion that people have religious faith that they appeal to. But you know, you have rent to pay, you have to make choices in life, and you know, the investments we make as a society have real bearing on how well you're going to do at all that stuff. The people in South Sudan have religion, and they don't do very well because they haven't been able to make those investments.
So the gentleman in the tie in the back? Had his hand up this whole time.
Hi, I'm Jeff Cavaservice. At the time that you were going to college, meritocracy was seen as a way of breaking through these structures of undeserved advantage. This was actually a way of singling out people who were in disadvantaged circumstances and raising them up. Why do you think now many social scientists see meritocracy itself as a source of inequality rather than the remedy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll tell you about a book that's coming that has what I think of as the very most persuasive and comprehensive answer to it. It's by the Yale Law School professor Daniel Markovits, and the title, at least the tentative title when I saw the book proposal last year, was Meritocracy and Its Discontents. And it's about how the credentialing system has created a supply of and a demand for credentials that really do matter for outcomes that people care about. If you get a Yale Law School degree, you're quite likely to eventually become a partner in a firm where you'll earn several $1 million a year. But at the same time, the life that's entailed on that track is not one that from the outside looks very attractive to a neutral observer. These people work 80, 85 hours a week. That's all they talk about is how many hours they work. They have very little time to take the money that they've earned and spend it on experiences. They don't spend much time hiking the Milford Track in New Zealand. They're bidding for penthouse apartments that overlook Central Park, and the effect is merely, somebody always had those apartments, but the effect now is you have to have $5 million a year even to bid credibly for one of them. So it's a station that has been created through these artificial means. You have to really break your neck. You have to start when you're a kid. Your parents buy you SAT coaching and Ivy-wise kids, $29,000, $30,000 a year consulting service to help build a resume for 4th and 5th graders that will make them more likely to get into a good middle school, which in turn will make them a better candidate for admission to Harvard or Yale when the time comes. This is not a life that in the aggregate looks like we've struck a very good bargain. So it's meritocratic to be sure, but this kind of meritocracy doesn't seem to be producing an outcome that collectively is very attractive if you stand back and look at it. The book won't be out for another year, but remember to look for it. I read the prospectus, and it was the most exciting thing I'd read in years, really.
This gentleman in the front has been waiting.
Thanks. My name's Jonathan Levy. I'd like to go back briefly to the definition that you gave of luck, because it just seems to me that it's a broad definition, and the policy implications of different types of luck are quite different. So you gave the example of narrowly avoiding getting run over by a car and being born in South Sudan. So to make it a little bit more, relevant to current U.S. public policy issues, and thinking back to the question your colleague raised about privilege, how would you apply your analysis to the challenge of racism in the United States? And what implications could you draw for public policies that perhaps should be put into place to ameliorate it, deal with it, or whatever? Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a difficult question. I mean, there's no doubt that if you're black in the United States, you suffer significant disadvantage of a whole multiple variety of kinds. When Barack Obama was accused of not being black enough, he reminded people that when he tried to hail a cab at night, he was black enough to experience the cost of being black in that situation. What's the best way to deal with that? That's a really difficult question. Should there be compensatory payments to try and make up for the handicap of being in a disadvantaged group? There are pros and cons to that. Should there be sort of income-based remedies only? Not everybody who's in a disadvantaged class is disadvantaged, so maybe we should think about tailoring the remedies we try to apply to more narrowly to the question of whether you as an individual actually need the remedy that's being offered. But no, I don't have anything unique or valuable to say about any of that. I feel terrible that we haven't been able to do anything really useful about that after 2 centuries.
The ma'am in the inner corner there.
Hi. I'm wondering why when people think about luck, they tend to exclude the luck of having been born with talents or gifts, or even the capacity and the either learned or innate of working hard, the ability to work hard, to either the physical stamina or the intellectual stamina or the moral stamina to work hard. Seems to me that those are equally subject to the vagaries of circumstance and luck, as much as any other qualifying.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in the book, I do note that if you're a talented, hardworking person, how did you get to be such a person? We don't know exactly, but current theories say it's some combination of your genetic inheritance and how you were raised. We don't know what the weights are on the different factors, but basically that's all we've got, genes and upbringing. Which of those 2 factors do you feel entitled to claim moral credit for? What kind of a moral moron would say, I deserve all this because I won that lottery? I think that's wrong-headed to think in those terms, but I went on to say in the book that wasn't my focus in the book. I was going to focus on external circumstances of a narrower sort. But yeah, your point is extremely well taken. And if you get up in the morning and you want to work hard, you're really lucky. I'm not that way. My wife is that way. I wish I were that way. I'm not. So celebrate that if that's how you are.
Hi, my name is David Smith. Presumably, if you followed it to its logical conclusion, you're denying the existence of free will if everything is down to genes and the way you're brought up. But more generally, I was just going to ask, do you think people who are struggling blame the absence of luck? Do they blame bad luck? To use another cultural example, death of a salesman. Do people tend to feel that it's their own fault that they haven't climbed the ladder, or do they attribute it to luck? And does that play a role in how arguably people who are less well off vote against their own interests, in that perhaps they will still vote for the candidate who will not tax the rich greatly because they still believe that they themselves will
They're
get there
lucky.
soon enough?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's actually a lot of research that relates directly to that. The finding, in brief, is that if you fail at something, you're much more likely to say that it was as a result of bad luck. If you succeed at something, there you'll attribute the favorable outcome to your skill and effort. And there's even a sense, psychologists have written, in which that asymmetry may be adaptive. So if you think about talent and hard work, they're persistent personal qualities. If you succeed at something and you say it's because of your talent and hard work, that means when the next opportunity comes along, should I risk something to pursue this opportunity? Well, if I think I succeeded in the past because I'm talented and able to work hard, then I should accept this opportunity too, take the risk here. If, on the other hand, I failed in the past and I say, oh, that was just bad luck. Bad luck's not a persistent personal trait, presumably. So I'll say, well, yeah, I'll try again, because who knows? I won't have bad luck every time. Does that make people willing to vote for candidates who don't serve their interests? Yeah, I don't really know that I have something to say about that. But the attitudes toward the estate tax, the estate tax seem supportive of the idea. There are consistent findings in polls that the lower quintile in the income distribution is just as opposed to the so-called death tax as people who actually might run some risk of their heirs paying the death tax are opposed to it. The lower quintile people, no one in their family has even a remote chance of paying the death tax, but they're against it. If you ask them, if we eliminate the estate tax, that would mean increasing sales or income taxes. Do you think we ought to do it? Then they'll say no. But if you just ask them, should we eliminate the death tax, then they'll say, yeah, sure, we ought to do that. So it depends how you ask the question.
So why did we have to wait for you to write this book? Why wasn't it done 50 years ago?
There must have been more eloquent versions of this book written thousands of years ago. I can't believe that there's anything in my book that's new or path-breaking. There's a little bit different mix of a lot of old ideas in there, but no, I don't think there's anything profoundly new here. Yeah, but that's a fair question. If you're so smart, how come you're not rich?
Okay, I should go to some of these people in the center aisle. Sure.
Hi, Randy Sim. You sounded pretty optimistic in that most of the examples you cited of people who would have to sacrifice are those who are going to have to give up their Ferrari or give up their elegant wedding, their very expensive wedding. But many of the analyses I've heard, which are premised on continuing an income tax regime as opposed to a consumption tax, say that there's not enough money in rich people to support this, the system that we have now of the size of the federal government, the size, I guess, of state and local, that you're really going to have to dip into the great middle class to support the structure that we have now, just to continue it on this basis with the entitlement system we have and all of that. So I'd like to hear your response. Is that a fair criticism, or is that, do you think that your proposal would avoid that?
It's manifestly unfair, but understandable, because the argument that you need to mount to explain why it's unfair isn't a natural argument for people to embrace. There's a phenomenon I've described in many of my earlier writings, and I call it the expenditure cascade. All the income growth has gone to the top. They've been spending more on mansions, weddings, cars, and other things. The people in the middle don't get angry about that, at least not in the US. Maybe you see rallies and protests in other countries, but that's not a problem ever that I've noticed in America. The middle class wants to see pictures of the mansions and the weddings. It's the people just below the top that are affected by those high-level expenditures. They go to the same weddings, they eat at the same dinner parties. Now our daughter's getting married, we need a ballroom because now it's the custom to have wedding receptions at home, not in the country club. So we build bigger. And then the people just below them, they need to have dinner parties for 24, not 18. They build bigger. And all the way down the ladder, now you have the median size of the new house built in the US is 50% larger than it was in 1980. Why is that? It's not because people in the middle have more money. It's that other people like them are spending on more expensive, larger houses. And if they don't, it's their kids that will end up going to the bad schools. Very close link between school quality and neighborhood house prices. So if you're the median earner and it's your goal to send your kids to a school of average quality, school quality, like everything else, is a relative concept, you've got to buy the median price house for your area, or it's your kids who will go to the schools where they have metal detectors out front and the kids in their classrooms are scoring in the 20th percentile in reading and math. So you've got to keep pace with what others at your income level are spending. So it's just gotten much more expensive to have your daughter's wedding, to buy a house, to do all these things. If we could slow the rate of growth of spending at the top, we would slow the rate of growth of expenditure in the middle. There are resources aplenty to pay for these things that we're hoping we had money to do. You know, it's not going to come just from the pockets of the rich, but the part of it that comes from lower expenditures in the middle will be reductions in expenditure with no consequence. Two parallel universes. One, they have 2,000 square foot houses. The other, they have 3,000 square foot houses. There's no difference in happiness between those two universes.
So over here in the side.
Hi, Dinesh Bhatt. A cursory reading of the Greek classics suggests that this dilemma between free will and divine providence has been addressed about 1,000 years ago, over 1,000 years ago. It's the same conflict that ails us today. But my question really is about the dilemma that I have in explaining why at the either end of the privilege scale, even the very underprivileged, uniformly don't demand social empathy. Likewise, the very top of the privileged, there is still a small percentage of those that spontaneously donate and provide social empathy. What is the feature that differentiates the thinking among humans, irrespective of privilege and at either end of the privilege scale? And will that address the issue at hand? An understanding of that human dichotomy.
Yeah, I don't have anything illuminating to say about that at all. I think how you think about what your options are in life is pretty complicated. Is it adaptive to believe that you don't have free will? Maybe not. I think that's an interesting debate. I happen to hold the view that if science progressed far enough, almost everything that anyone does could be predicted from past information. So that's the no free will camp in the debate. There are experiments, though, that show that if you prime someone to believe that there's no free will, then they don't spend as much time working on a difficult problem that you give them to solve. They quit earlier. The people whom you prime to believe that there's free will, they stick with it longer. So if I'm right, then believing that there's free will is a false belief. But holding that belief may be adaptive in some perverse way. It makes you behave in ways that are more likely to advance your cause. It may be true of religion as well. Maybe religion is false, contrary to what many believe. But maybe believing it advances your ability to cope with the problems that you confront in life in meaningful ways. I don't have anything intelligent or meaningful to add to any of that discussion. That's hard stuff. It's way above my pay grade. I do talk in the book, I speculate in the book about why many people are so insistent that luck doesn't matter, that luck had nothing to do with it. It may be that believing you're the captain of your own fate is the best way to think about your life as you go forward. If you teach your kids, wow, the life's a crapshoot, you might work your tail off and still fail. It might be harder for people who were given that message to summon the energy they need to become an expert at something. That takes a lot of work. You're not going to get any payoff until years pass, and even then you might not get any payoff at all from all that effort. If you think chance is a big part of it, the hell with it. I'm not going to spend the effort. Somebody who thinks of herself as the captain of her own fate is more likely maybe to expend that effort. I don't know why people hold to this belief that luck doesn't matter, but it's clear that luck does matter, and that if as a society we act as if it doesn't matter, we're going to have a pretty mean society. We actually do have a pretty mean society by the standards of industrial nations.
Okay. So I think we're going to wrap it up with that. I'd like to thank everybody for the happy accident of all of us being here together to hear about Bob's book.
Even the fact that we exist with a happy
it's pretty nice. And thank you to Bob and to New America for hosting this great discussion.
Thank you.
Oh Lord, let me listen to the